their seats. Under the previous order, the Senate will take their seats. The Senate will come to order. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 175, H.R. 3590, signed by 18 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call is waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 3590, the Service Members Home Ownership Tax Act of 2009, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
No.
Mr. Barrasso.
No.
Mr. Balkus. Mr. Bott. Mr. Bai.
Aye.
Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett of Colorado.
Aye.
Mr. Bennett of Utah. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bond.
No.
Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Mr. Brownback.
No.
Mr. Bunning.
No.
Mr. Burr.
No.
Mr. Burris. Mr. Byrd. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss.
No.
Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Dodd.
Aye.
Mr. Dorgan. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Ensign. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Feingold. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken.
Aye.
Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Gregg.
No.
Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Noway. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans.
No.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Carey. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lemieux. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mrs. Lincoln. Mr. Lugar. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Mr. Spector. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter.
No.
Mr. Vornovich. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Carper. Mr. Cochran. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Burris. Mr. Bingaman. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Cole. Mr. Carey. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Pryor. Mrs. Lincoln. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Menendez. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. Beckich. Mrs. Gillibrand. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Baucus, Bai, Beckich, Bennett of Colorado, Bingaman, Boxer, Brown, Burris, Byrd, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Conrad, Dodd, Dorgan, Durbin, Feingold, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Inouye, Kaufman, Carey, Kirk, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Lincoln, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Spector, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wyden.